Hello, my dear friends. How are you? Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Ari Theriger, and today I'll talk about the decline of Greenland from the historical point of Nordic colonization and occupation of the land since the first Icelandic-Norwegian sea voyage exploration and the sudden disappearance of Greenlanders. Given the current political climate of Trump's insistence on the US claiming Greenland, there's been quite a lot of distortion of the historical truth, as well as the truth in general. However, and as it has always been, the distortion of history and the construction of alternative histories has been a powerful political tool to control the masses, and the climate of collective ignorance leads people to support and act on the behalf of powerful leaders who have no need to lose their privileges in order to achieve their goals, because the masses can be easily manipulated through ignorance and manipulated into bringing to life the dreams and wishes of the elites. This is what is happening right now on many aspects of past and present history, and given the amount of inaccuracies and falsehoods right now about the history of Greenland and its Nordic colonization and administration, I would like to contribute to this topic in order for people to be more, let's say, aware of the history of Greenland since its colonization by Norwegians, Icelanders, Icelandic Norwegians, whatever. And I take the opportunity to say that in all these political struggles and who has claim over which land, we often forget about the indigenous peoples. And once again, and sadly not surprising, we are once again forgetting the indigenous populations of Greenland, who inhabited the land long before the first Norwegian colonial efforts. I'm quite sure the indigenous populations of Greenland have plenty to say, and I do hope they are brought into this current political issue. It has been proven over and over again that the more indigenous peoples are heard and the more they participate in the world's numerous debates, the faster we walk towards a better future, or at least other alternative ways to reach a point into creating a more habitable and pleasant world for us all can be reached and achieved with more sensitivity, empathy, and with the mind turned into living a proper world for the next generations. Now, my dear friends, with no more delay, let's get started and straight to the point, if you please. The Icelandic sagas tell us that Greenland was colonized by Erkur the Red, an Icelander of Norwegian origin in 1985 of the Common Era. And indeed, archaeology has confirmed the settlement of the western coast of the Arctic island, having already excavated the sites of at least 300 farms and 16 churches and several chapels and 2 monasteries. There were 2 settlement centers, right? A more populous and prosperous one located in the fjords of the southernmost point, whose name was Heiðreby, literally eastern settlement, and the smaller one further north around the area of the current capital, whose name was Vestreby, western settlement, right? This name has long confused historians and archaeologists who for a very long time have long desperately searched for evidences of human occupation on the eastern coast without success. In fact, it is much more inhospitable than the western one, so the names of the 2 settlements derive only from a somewhat liberal use of the cardinal points without taking into account that the coast is in fact inclined from northwest to southeast, and that therefore, although it is decidedly further south than the western settlement, the eastern one is also a little further east. I think at this point we shouldn't take seriously the names that Norwegian and Icelandic settlers gave to places because, well, Greenland is a lot more ice than green, and Iceland is a lot more green than ice. So the designation of these settlements, well, we should have known better. We have to take into account, of course, that the sagas are a much later literary source, dating back to at least the 13th century. And the oldest source we have about Greenland is a letter dated to January the 6th, 1053, from Pope Leo IX to the Archbishop of Hamburg, Bremen, under whose archdiocese the Diocese of Greenland was located. Anyway, throughout the Middle Ages, however, we have very few documents about the situation in Greenland. The last is a marriage certificate transcribed in Iceland in 1407. In the 15th century, contacts were interrupted due to the spread of the plague in Northern Europe. From the following century onwards, there were some sporadic approaches by European navigators, but apparently without landings or contact with local populations, of course, that we know of, which must have already disappeared by that time, the local population, being replaced by the Inuit, who arrived in Greenland in the 1200s and moved south in the following centuries. This does not mean that there were no other indigenous populations, or indeed the Inuit in there before these Inuit, this migration of the Inuit and before Icelandic colonizers, only that apparently from the excavations already carried out, the Inuit arrived in this territory around the beginning of the 13th century, at least a huge population of Inuit, perhaps as a return after the Nordic population started to disappear. It was only with the Danish religious mission of Hans Eo that the definitive extinction of the local population of Nordic lineage was discovered, and it is estimated that this population may have reached a maximum of between 2,500 and 6,000, and that they eventually disappeared completely. And just one side note, given that Denmark and Portugal are one of the oldest countries in Europe, it is understandable and natural that the earliest alliances between European countries were precisely between the Portuguese and the Danes, and the Portuguese and the English as well. But anyway, as such, the Portuguese and the Danes, there were quite a lot of sea voyages of colonization and exploration through the Portuguese-Danish alliance, some of which in great scale led by the Portuguese into what is now Canada, and many of Canada's place names being named after the Portuguese explorers, colonizers, and captains, and so on and so forth, long before Columbus reached the Americas. In fact, the Portuguese and Danes together have made plenty of very detailed maps of what is now Canada and the eastern coast of the US, and Columbus didn't found shite, not only because you cannot find a land that has already people in it, but because Columbus literally just had to follow the very extremely detailed maps the Portuguese and Danes had already created of the land he set himself to conquer and Christianize. But that's a topic for another time, right? But it's just an historical curiosity, given what we are talking about, this geographical reality, which, well, certainly makes us wonder, right? Why nothing of this is taught in schools, despite such events having been well documented, and you even have museums solely dedicated to such historical events. I mean, some countries really still push an alternative historical narrative for their own political gains. I think the case of the disappearance of the Nordic populations would make a very interesting horror movie, a folk horror, right? I love that type of film. Here's a suggestion. Because even today, the disappearance or extinction of Greenlanders of Nordic origin remains a debate topic, actually, and numerous hypotheses have been put forward to explain it. In most cases, it does not appear that people died of starvation, and archaeological evidences seem to indicate that the Greenlanders were well adapted to the conditions presented to them by the changing climate, because archaeological studies so far seem to suggest that the population was relatively healthy, judging by analysis done on bodies or human osteological remains excavated from cemeteries, and imported goods, objects, clothing, and other things continue to arrive from Europe into Greenland, until the 15th century, and that later generations would have left spontaneously to move to Iceland perhaps or elsewhere, although evidences of that or of this has never been found. However, the absence of important objects of daily use in some places suggests planned abandonment. Where did they go? It's not known yet. Perhaps it was some kind of cult to the monstrous sea god, and they were all returned to the sea. And from time to time, these half-human offsprings of Dagon return to torment the shores. If you know that reference, welcome to the club. It is unlikely that people would just let themselves die out of starvation, in this case, of course, in this particular case, without asking for help or adapting to the circumstances. As we know, through the archaeological evidences, that survival would and was possible for both the Norse and the Inuit, especially since they adapted over the course of a few centuries, and they thrived, apparently. And we even have a very important tale about supposedly Norse magical practices that are very similar to what the Sami in Scandinavia also did. This account being, of course, the late 13th century account which depicts divinatory rituals among pagan Icelandic settlers in Greenland, precisely in Erik's saga, chronicles the Icelandic colonization of Greenland, as well as colonists' forays west to Vinland. But in the first chapter of the saga, there is an epidemic, and there is this practitioner of divine arts called Thorbjörg, and she calls the spirits, the helping spirits, for aid. Anyway, I've talked about this before several times, but I can make a video about it if you like. Tell me about it in the comments. But just to point out that she was probably an indigenous person, perhaps Inuit, and we see a mixture here of indigenous, Inuit, and Norse pagan rituals. So there was this important interaction. Just something that came to mind because I do love that account. But anyway, we do know that an exploratory mission from the eastern to the western settlement in the mid-14th century found no trace of humans, as if the local population had disappeared. However, they did not have a naval fleet that would allow them to move en masse, right? Moreover, if they had decided to leave, I think their compatriots in the eastern settlement would probably have heard of it, I think, at least from the authorities who were supposed to collect taxes and administer the territory. But nothing. What happened to them is still a mystery. Unless, of course, the plot was precisely to hide from the tax collectors. There are accounts, actually, that cows were left behind, important animals for their subsistence, for the subsistence of these people and their economy, and animals that could not survive on their own in such climates and needed to be tended constantly. And yet the animals were there, still healthy and thriving. Did the Greenlanders really disappear, or were they hiding? Please, someone do a folk horror movie on this. It is also a mystery why the eastern settlement itself disappeared so suddenly in the course of the next century, the 15th century. It has been proposed that there was a migration of new generations of Greenlanders who left the harsh living conditions of Greenland to join the crews of the numerous European ships that passed through there, especially the Portuguese, Icelandic, and English. Perhaps we are facing a case that still happens a lot today, actually. Young populations seek new lives elsewhere, leaving an aging population behind, which eventually dies out and the populations simply disappear. This is a very strong reality in my country, Portugal. Many villages, like the one I came from, are completely deserted, abandoned. My village still has some people, but in the past 20 years, everyone I knew is either dead or gone to other places. And many of the houses are abandoned and falling into ruin. This may well have been the case in Greenland, which spoils the mystery, of course. The point here is that we know that after the colonization of Greenland in the 10th century, mid-10th century, until the beginning of the perhaps 16th century, or at least until the end of the 15th century, Greenland was quite inhabited, with hundreds of farms, farmsteads, churches, even monasteries, with a great commercial activity and contacts with Europe, mainland Europe, which were progressively reduced, of course, with the plague in Europe. But it was a highly colonized land and then inhabited for a good few centuries and with quite a large population. We know that there were Christians, pagans, and also the Inuit. Mysteriously, they disappeared, leaving their animals behind. However, it is clear that there is a vast and important history in Greenland, and the more archaeological excavations are carried out, the more is revealed about Greenland's historical past. And I do hope this video was helpful, or at the very least, entertaining. My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.